April 17, 1941, Portsmouth, England, 2200 hours. Private Mary Churchill gripped the Predictor's range wheel as her hands trembled slightly in the cold night air. Through the darkness above, 53 Heinkel bombers droned toward the naval dockyards in tight formation. The 7-ton mechanical calculator before her, a maze of gears, cams, and differential mechanisms, waited for her input. She was 18 years old, 3 months out of grammar school, and in 45 seconds she would calculate the precise point in empty sky where German bombers would die. If you're discovering these hidden corners of history for the first time, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's Manchester, Montreal, or Melbourne. These forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us bring them to light. Now, let's return to that April night in Portsmouth, because what happened in the next 90 minutes would prove something the Luftwaffe never suspected. Mary's fingers moved across the control wheels with practiced precision. Range data from the radar team crackled through field telephones. Height, bearing, speed. Each number translated into mechanical rotation. The Predictor's gears meshed and turned, calculating trajectories through three-dimensional space while accounting for wind velocity, shell ballistics, and the inexorable mathematics of intercept geometry. When the guns opened fire 45 seconds later, their shells burst precisely at 14,000 feet, directly into the bomber stream. 2 Heinkels sustained critical damage and turned for France with smoking engines. And in that moment, as Mary watched the successful engagement unfold through data that flowed across her instruments, she understood something German intelligence would never discover. That teenage girls were outperforming the veteran male artillery crews they'd replaced. The crisis had been building for months before anyone dared propose the solution. By February 1941, Britain's anti-aircraft command faced mathematics with no comfortable answer. Defending the nation's cities, ports, and industrial centers required approximately 200,000 personnel. Current manning levels stood at 140,000 and dropping. Every week, men were siphoned away to North Africa where Rommel's Africa Corps demanded reinforcements. Bomber Command competed aggressively for anyone with mechanical aptitude. The pool of available men who met traditional artillery requirements was essentially exhausted. General Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, watched his defensive network crumble through simple attrition. Bristol endured 6 major raids in February alone. Belfast received its first heavy attack. Cardiff, Plymouth, Portsmouth all experienced sustained bombardment while his gun batteries operated with skeleton crews working double shifts. Gun commanders reported deteriorating performance as fatigue accumulated. Slower response times, reduced accuracy, increased mechanical errors from crews too exhausted to maintain proper discipline. The Luftwaffe continued methodically targeting provincial cities through that brutal winter. While the sustained blitz on London had peaked the previous autumn, German bomber groups maintained relentless pressure. Each raid demanded full battery deployment. Each engagement pushed crews further past sustainable operational limits. Battery commanders filed reports documenting the decline, rounds fired per hit climbing, tracking accuracy degrading, response times to new targets lengthening dangerously. The War Office confronted an unacceptable choice. Accept reduced anti-aircraft coverage and essentially cede air superiority over British cities, or challenge every assumption about who could serve in combat roles. Every male between 18 and 41 capable of military service was already serving, scheduled for conscription, or working in reserved occupations essential for war production. Lowering physical standards offered minimal relief and raised concerns about stamina for operating heavy equipment through 8-hour shifts during sustained raids. The Auxiliary Territorial Service had been lobbying for expanded roles since 1938. Senior ATS officers argued their recruits demonstrated identical aptitude for mechanical and mathematical work when given proper training. They pointed to women's proven performance operating searchlights under bombing raids as evidence of adequate nerve under fire. Most compellingly, they noted that predictor operation, the critical function of calculating firing solutions, demanded mathematical precision, fine motor control, and sustained concentration rather than raw physical strength required for handling ammunition. The arguments were sound, but they violated institutional orthodoxy that had governed military organization since professional armies first emerged. The mechanical predictors, essentially analog computers weighing 7 tons, required operators who understood ballistics, could visualize three-dimensional trajectories, and possessed the endurance for sustained operation under fire. Every military establishment in Europe operated under the assumption that this represented men's work exclusively. The possibility that 18-year-old girls fresh from typing pools and shop counters could perform these calculations under combat conditions simply didn't register as credible within conventional military thinking. In March 1941, the War Office authorized a limited trial. Selected ATS volunteers would receive full predictor training and deploy to mixed batteries where they would operate gun-laying equipment alongside male personnel who continued handling physical ammunition and gun maintenance. The experiment was framed carefully, temporary, limited in scope, subject to immediate termination if performance proved inadequate. What the War Office didn't anticipate was that these teenage women would not merely prove adequate. They would excel in ways that shattered every assumption about capability and combat roles. The Predictor Training School at Rhyl in North Wales received its first intake of ATS volunteers in late March. The Vickers Predictor Mark I, that would become their tool of war, occupied the space of a small motor car and performed continuous three-dimensional calculus. It tracked an aircraft's current position while simultaneously calculating where that aircraft would be when a shell fired now, taking 15 to 20 seconds to reach altitude. Arrived at the intercept point. Aircraft speed, rate of climb or descent, wind velocity at multiple altitudes, ballistic characteristics of specific ammunition, shell time of flight accounting for air density that decreased with altitude. All these factors had to be processed continuously and translated into firing angles for gun crews. 3 operators worked as a coordinated team on each predictor. The height and range operator input data from radar tracking teams, constantly updating the target's position as it moved. The fuse operator calculated precise time delay required for shells to explode at the predicted intercept point. The speed and bearing operator tracked the target's velocity and direction, feeding this information into the mechanical computer's differential gears. Each operator manipulated large control wheels and dials, making continuous adjustments as targets maneuvered. The predictor synthesized all 3 inputs and output firing solutions to gun crews, elevation angles and bearing coordinates that changed second by second as engagements developed. Training proved physically demanding in ways the young women hadn't anticipated. The control wheels required constant manipulation with considerable resistance deliberately engineered into the system to prevent accidental inputs. An engagement might last 5 to 10 minutes of continuous tracking and adjustment. A sustained raid could demand 3 to 4 hours of nearly uninterrupted operation as successive bomber waves approached. Those who couldn't sustain the physical and mental demands were quietly reassigned to other ATS roles. Those who remained faced progressively more demanding scenarios, simulating chaos, noise, and pressure of actual combat conditions they'd soon experience when deployed to operational batteries. By early April, the first mixed batteries deployed to defensive positions. Portsmouth represented a deliberate choice for operational debut, a priority target for Luftwaffe bombing that ensured new crews would face combat testing immediately, but also a location with sufficient existing gun coverage that any initial performance failures wouldn't leave critical infrastructure undefended. The battery commander, a veteran artillery officer, who'd spent 6 months arguing against the entire concept of female gun crews, watched his 18-year-old predictor team take their positions with undisguised skepticism. The Luftwaffe provided their examination on the night of April 17th. The first wave arrived at 14,000 feet in tight formation, a standard approach profile that German crews had used successfully throughout the winter blitz. What they encountered was anti-aircraft fire of unexpected precision. The mixed batteries predictor team tracked the formation from initial radar contact, their inputs feeding targeting solutions that placed shell bursts directly into the bomber stream, rather than in the scattered pattern that typically characterized night anti-aircraft fire. The engagement lasted 90 minutes as 3 successive waves approached Portsmouth. Throughout that period, Mary Churchill and her fellow operators maintained accurate tracking, coordinating effectively with male gun crews, and demonstrating no hesitation despite experiencing their first exposure to actual combat conditions. The concussion from heavy guns positioned 50 yards away rattled equipment and bones alike. Shell casings ejected from gun breaches landed with metallic crashes. Cordite smoke drifted across battery positions, burning eyes and throats. Through it all, the predictor team's hands moved steadily across control wheels, translating mathematics into death at 14,000 feet. 2 Heinkels sustained damage severe enough to abort their bombing runs, jettisoning loads over empty countryside before turning for France. A third aircraft, hit by shell fragments that destroyed its port engine and hydraulics, limped across the channel before crash landing at its base near Caen. The surviving crew reported to Luftwaffe intelligence officers that Portsmouth's anti-aircraft defenses had demonstrated marked improvement since previous raids. Their testimony noted that shell bursts had consistently appeared at their precise altitude rather than in the usual vertical spread, and that Flak had tracked their formation through evasive turns with what seemed like predictive accuracy. German intelligence officers compiled these reports with similar accounts from other crews who'd faced British defenses in recent weeks. The pattern suggested systematic improvement across anti-aircraft command rather than isolated incidents at specific locations. Analysts proposed several explanations. New radar equipment with enhanced tracking accuracy topped the list. Improved ammunition with more reliable fuses. Possibly new fire control systems purchased or copied from American designs. Some reports speculated about enhanced training programs for British gun crews. What none of the intelligence assessments considered, what the institutional framework of German military thinking couldn't accommodate, was that the improvement stemmed from changing who operated the predictors, rather than advancing the technology itself. This analytical blind spot reflected broader assumptions about modern warfare's technical character. German doctrine emphasized that military effectiveness in the mechanized age depended on superior equipment and engineering. When an opponent demonstrated improved performance, the reflexive explanation involved better technology rather than better personnel utilization. The possibility that Britain had discovered an untapped manpower resource that actually exceeded the performance of traditional artillery crews contradicted everything Wehrmacht personnel doctrine taught about capability and combat roles. The Portsmouth battery commander filed his after-action report with considerably more enthusiasm than he'd shown during deployment. His ATS predictor crew had maintained accurate tracking throughout a sustained engagement lasting 90 minutes. Performance metrics, rounds fired per hit, tracking accuracy, response time to new targets, matched or exceeded the battery's previous performance with all male crews. The report concluded that subject to continued monitoring, the mixed battery concept appeared operationally viable. Similar reports arrived at anti-aircraft command headquarters throughout late April and early May, as additional mixed batteries deployed and engaged Luftwaffe raids. The experiment was quietly becoming established practice, with ATS recruitment for predictor training expanding to meet growing demand. The institutional resistance that had nearly prevented the program's initiation now gave way to pragmatic acceptance of demonstrated effectiveness under actual combat conditions. By summer 1941, mixed batteries had transitioned from experimental formations to standard operational doctrine. The physical toll of sustained operations imposed demands that military planners had never imagined teenage girls could sustain. An 8-hour shift operating a predictor during active raids meant exerting sustained force, comparable to cranking a manual automobile starter for minutes without pause. During concentrated raids, predictor operators might track targets continuously for 3 to 4 hours, with only brief intervals between waves. Medical officers monitoring mixed batteries documented chronic muscle strain in shoulders and forearms from repetitive manipulation of control wheels. Many reported persistent headaches from sustained concentration in dim lighting, whilst following rapidly changing numerical displays. Despite documented performance under conditions that matched or exceeded anything expected of male combat personnel, official recognition remained constrained by institutional discomfort with acknowledging women's combat contributions. Battery commanders who witnessed their female crews perform under fire with courage and skill, equivalent to decorated male personnel, found their recommendations for decorations returned with notes, suggesting that such recognition might establish problematic precedents for women's military service in the post-war period. Newspaper accounts of successful air defense actions routinely credited our gunners, without mentioning that predictor operators were women. Ministry of Information photographs showing anti-aircraft operations were carefully composed to emphasize male gun crews handling ammunition, whilst keeping predictor stations out of frame. By January 1944, over 2,000 ATS women operated predictors across Britain's defensive networks, their performance metrics consistently matching the pre-war all-male batteries they'd replaced. What remained untested was how these crews would perform against sustained, concentrated attacks of the type that had characterized the Blitz of 1940-41. Operation Steinbock, the Luftwaffe's final major bombing offensive against Britain, would provide that test under conditions that perfectly showcased how far British air defenses had evolved, whilst German tactical doctrine had stagnated. Operation Steinbock commenced on the night of January 21, 1944, with raids targeting London. Hitler had personally ordered this campaign as retaliation for RAF Bomber Command's devastating attacks on German cities, demanding that the Luftwaffe demonstrate it could still strike the British capital with impunity. The 474 bombers assembled for the operation represented virtually every serviceable aircraft German forces could spare from other theaters. Crews received briefings emphasizing that London's defenses would be formidable, but that proven evasion tactics would provide adequate protection against predictable British flak patterns. The Richmond Park Battery Complex, positioned southwest of central London, held responsibility for defending the approach corridor that Luftwaffe formations had historically used with considerable success. German bomber crews favored this route because it offered good navigation landmarks along the Thames, provided options for quick escape runs back to the Channel, and had historically demonstrated manageable flak density. Intelligence assessments from 1942 suggested that batteries in this sector could be overwhelmed by concentrated formations. Those assessments were catastrophically outdated. The Richmond Park batteries opened fire on the first Steinbock wave at 23:15 hours with accuracy that immediately disrupted German formations. ATS predictor crews tracked incoming bombers from ranges exceeding 20 miles, their calculations fed by improved radar that provided continuous target updates. As formations approached their bombing runs, the predictor teams demonstrated their most critical skill, anticipating evasive maneuvers rather than simply following the aircraft. When Luftwaffe pilots executed their standard defensive turns and altitude changes, they discovered that shell bursts appeared exactly where they'd turned to rather than where they'd been, as if the British gunners were predicting their tactical decisions. This predictive accuracy reflected 3 years of operational experience that predictor crews had accumulated. The teenage women who'd nervously tracked their first targets in spring 1941 were now veterans who recognized Luftwaffe evasive patterns instinctively. They knew that bombers approaching from specific vectors typically turned at particular landmarks. They understood that pilots under pressure from searchlights tended to dive and turn left. They'd learned to input the completion point of a maneuver into their predictors before the aircraft finished executing it, ensuring that firing solutions accounted for where the target would stabilize rather than its transitional position. Combat statistics from the first week of Steinbock demonstrated the transformation. Richmond Park batteries achieved hit rates approaching 8%, meaning 8 shells per 100 fired either struck aircraft directly or detonated close enough to cause damage. Pre-war doctrine had estimated that 3 to 4% represented acceptable performance for night anti-aircraft fire. The 1940 Blitz had seen actual rates closer to 2%. The female-operated predictor teams were achieving accuracy levels that exceeded not only current German expectations, but Britain's own pre-war performance benchmarks, with experienced male artillery crews. Luftwaffe crews returning from Steinbock missions reported their experiences with notable frustration. Approach corridors that had been reliable throughout 1941 and 1942 now proved deadly. The Richmond Park sector, previously considered navigable with standard evasion protocols, had become what German pilots termed a flak trap, airspace where British gunners seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver. Intelligence officers compiled these reports and once again attributed improved British performance to technological advancement. Speculation focused on new radar systems, possibly American-supplied fire control computers, or enhanced communications networks. The possibility that improved performance stemmed from operator experience rather than equipment upgrades remained outside the analytical framework that German military intelligence applied to such questions. What those intelligence assessments completely missed was the extraordinary physical and psychological toll that sustained operations imposed on the predictor crews themselves. During concentrated raids like those characterizing Steinbock, predictor operators worked through conditions that military doctrine had insisted only men could handle. The sensory assault eroded concentration and nerve, heavy guns generating concussion that rattled equipment, cordite smoke burning eyes and throats, German bombers overhead occasionally dropping loads directly on gun positions. 23 ATS personnel died at their posts during Steinbock when a bomber jettisoned its load whilst taking evasive action over a South London battery complex. The survivors at that site were back on duty within 48 hours, operating salvaged predictors that had been hastily relocated and recalibrated. By April 1944, Luftwaffe bomber crews began reporting something that contradicted intelligence assessments. Approach vectors identified as safe in 1942 now produced concentrated, accurate fire that shattered formations before they reached bombing points. More disturbingly, British gunners seemed to anticipate evasive maneuvers rather than react to them. Squadron commanders authorized desperate tactical modifications, climbing to 19 or 20,000 feet, accepting reduced bombing accuracy to stay above altitude bands where British flak proved most lethal. These adaptations undermined everything Steinbock was meant to achieve. Higher altitude bombing scattered payloads uselessly across empty countryside. Dispersed formations fell prey to night fighters. Operation Steinbock's strategic goal, demonstrating the Luftwaffe could still inflict meaningful damage on British cities, collapsed into scattered raids that caused casualties but failed to disrupt war production or break morale. The truth emerged only after the war through official histories published in the late 1940s. The revelation generated surprisingly little attention. Britain's wartime narrative had already been written around fighter pilots and bomber crews. 2,000 ATS women who'd calculated firing solutions under bombardment fitted awkwardly into established stories. But military recruiting doctrine changed quietly and fundamentally. Staff colleges examining the anti-aircraft campaign couldn't dismiss the statistics. Female-operated predictor teams had achieved hit rates matching or exceeding pre-war all-male crews. They'd sustained operational effectiveness through campaigns that tested stamina and nerve. They demonstrated that combat effectiveness in increasingly technical warfare depended less on physical strength and more on aptitude for managing complex systems under pressure. The Luftwaffe pilots who dodged increasingly accurate British flak never learned the truth about who'd been calculating those firing solutions. Most went to their graves believing they'd faced new technology, rather than discovering that 18-year-old women had outperformed their intelligence services' expectations. That ignorance represented perhaps the most enduring victory those young women achieved, demonstrating excellence so complete that even the enemy never suspected the transformation had occurred. The shells that burst at 14,000 feet carried no signature revealing whether they'd been aimed by veteran artillery sergeants or teenage girls 3 months out of grammar school. Mathematics doesn't care who performs the calculations. It only cares that the calculations are correct. And on that cold April night in Portsmouth, and through 3 years of sustained operations that followed, those calculations were devastatingly, undeniably correct.